Les habla Pocho Salcedo y damos la bienvenida a nuestra audiencia en el Cono Sur y a todos aquellos que nos acompañan de costa a costa en los Estados Unidos de Norteamérica, en Hawái y en Puerto Rico. Una vez más, invitándolos desde Nueva York a una caminata que va más allá de los titulares. Bienvenidos al ADN de las noticias. El resultado de la invasión de Rusia a Ucrania sigue en duda, pero no dudamos de las cosas que van a cambiar sustancialmente en Rusia, Europa y la alianza de la OTAN. La decisión de Vladimir Putin de lanzar una invasión a gran escala es una de esas decisiones estratégicas que están impactando a países y a millones de personas como ninguna otra en décadas. Es más, hay una gran posibilidad de que el resultado del conflicto de Ucrania deje a Putin y a Rusia en peores condiciones que las que prevalecían en ese país el 24 de febrero del 2022, que fue cuando comenzó la guerra. Hoy tenemos el gusto de contar con la visita de un experto reconocidísimo internacionalmente, una autoridad en temas de Rusia. Es un gusto de tener con nosotros nuevamente en el programa a nuestro amigo, el profesor Laurel Brown. Él se conecta con nosotros, desde Toronto, Canadá. Profesor Laurel Brown, bienvenido al programa.
My pleasure.
Laurel Brown is currently a professor of international relations and political science at the University of Toronto. He is also a Center Associate of the Davis Center at Harvard University. Additionally, he is a senior member of the Center for Eurasian, Russian and East European Studies at the Munk School of Global Affairs, and a Fellow and Senator of Trinity College, all at the University of Toronto. In December 2012, Professor Braun was awarded the Queen Elizabeth II Diamond Jubilee Medal for services to Canada and for academic distinction by the Governor-General of Canada. He is the author and/or editor of several books. His latest book is NATO-Russia Relations in the 21st Century. His forthcoming book is on Russia, the West and Arctic Security.
Well, and let's start jumping to the deep side of the pool right away. Did the West fail to develop and execute a deterrence policy, either of denial or punishment, to Russia to avoid the invasion of February of 2022? And similarly, why Russia was not able to deter the growth of NATO members surrounding its territory?
Let's start with the first part of it. And I think the evidence clearly points to the fact that the West has failed to deter because Russia did invade. The Biden administration has been very proud of having predicted the invasion, but they did not prevent it. And that is, of course, crucial because there has been such devastating loss of life. The Russian forces have not succeeded in taking Kiev and removing the government of President Zelensky, but they have inflicted terrible damage. And clearly, Vladimir Putin is frustrated by the enlargement of NATO. They had not been able to prevent it. In fact, they may be facing more enlargement should Finland and Sweden decide to join. But I don't think that is necessarily the primary motivating factor. I think what he feared most in the case of Ukraine was that Ukraine could become a successful democratic state that is Western-oriented, that would present an alternate model to the kind of dictatorship that is running inside Russia. So it was that fear of contamination, because it was not just coincidence that prior to the invasion, the level of repression within Russia was dramatically increased.
So, in your view, it was not a provocation of the NATO countries to expand their membership. Putin, as a matter of fact, just recently in a major speech, scolded the West for failing to heed Russian demands for security guarantees and roll back NATO expansion?
In 2014, Russia invaded Ukraine. There had been that NATO enlargement already, and the excuse at that point was that the Ukrainian government was reaching some agreements, vague agreements, with the European Union. So the European Union was the excuse at that point. So it's obvious that Russia would prefer that NATO had not enlarged. It's obvious that they would have preferred to have some kind of security guarantees. But that doesn't mean that this was the primary reason for Russia to engage in this attack. I think it was a combination of fear of democratic contamination. There's nothing that Vladimir Putin fears more than democracy, because that would lead to the removal of this repressive kleptocratic government, a very corrupt government that is running. And so he wanted to prevent that. But the other element that Vladimir Putin doesn't really want to see is, in addition to this kind of danger of contamination, he doesn't want to see any kind of challenges to the image of Russia of invincibility. And so he looks for opportunities to divert attention away from domestic problems by trying to find external successes. And it seemed tempting when you look back to prior these events in February of this year. What was the picture? Well, the West was not willing to sell defensive armaments to Ukraine in many cases. Germany refused to do that. Canada refused to do that. United States only allowed a small trickle. The President of the United States kept saying NATO will not be involved directly. So it's almost as if Vladimir Putin was looking at the international picture and saying, in 2008, we went into Georgia, my popularity increased domestically, and I got away with it. In 2014, we went into Ukraine, eastern Ukraine, we annexed Crimea illegally, the sanctions that were leveled were ineffective, and my popularity increased domestically. In 2015, we went into Syria, we propped up the regime of Bashar al-Assad, and nothing was done to prevent us. So why should we not be able to take an opportunity to crush Ukraine, to change the regime in Ukraine, to put pressure on NATO? So it was a combination of a need to prevent democratic contamination and a perception of opportunity. And I think that combination proved to be toxic.
So did Putin execute his plan according to what he thought the invasion would be and simply failed to perform well, or did he have a mistaken view of what Russia would expect in Ukraine and the military strategy was ill-designed? What happened then?
If we look at it from the perspective of the Kremlin and their calculations, those calculations were not irrational, because the expectation was that the West was not going to come to the rescue of Ukraine, that there were going to be protests, but not much will be done, that the Ukrainian forces will collapse, that this regime inside the country of Ukraine would not have the ability to withstand a Russian attack. And they came very close to achieving that. Just think of the advice that the Biden administration gave to President Zelensky on the first day of the invasion, which was to evacuate. And we could do a thought experiment. If the president of Ukraine had fled the way the president of Afghanistan had fled, that would have led to a collapse of morale. The Russian forces were landing at airports. They were pushing from the north. Vladimir Putin could very well have had this victory parade. But where the miscalculation came about was President Zelensky. President Zelensky refused to leave. President Zelensky was defiant. President Zelensky shamed the West into helping. When the Ukrainians resisted, when he said, "I need ammunition, I am not looking for a ride," that sent a kind of Churchillian message, which was, we will fight whatever it takes. And there were then massive protests in Germany in support of Ukraine. The German government had a dramatic change of policy. Over 30 years of policy were reversed virtually overnight, where Germany said, we are now going to spend 100 billion euros on rearming. We are going to commit to 2% of the GDP expenditures on defense, which they didn't do for 30 years. We are going to now so change our policies that Russian energy dependence will be diminished. Well, these were dramatic changes that were not anticipated. This is something that would not have happened had Zelensky had fled. So when we say now that Vladimir Putin made catastrophically bad decisions, the effect is indeed that. I think they were catastrophically bad decisions, but they were not done in the case of a kind of wild gamble. It was that he did not count, just as in the case of the Second World War, where the Nazis did not count on Churchill. And we know that if Neville Chamberlain had stayed as prime minister, the outcome might have been very, very different. We know that if Lord Halifax had become prime minister, the outcome might have been very different. So what it tells us is that, yes, at levels of analysis, we look at individuals, we look at the unit of the state, we look at the system, but we tend to forget that it does make a difference who the leaders are. Leadership matters.
Well, thank you very much. We just came to the end of this first segment. There's so much more to discuss about this. We just scratched the surface, literally. We'll be right back. Thank you. So we're back with Professor Laurel Brown. He joins us from Toronto, Canada. And I would like to ask you, from what we can see, the Ukrainians now have a stronger sense of national identity. They have declared Russia a sworn enemy. Russian military has not performed very effectively. NATO now has renewed sense of unity and purpose. Even countries like Germany and France are increasing their spending in military affairs, and Finland and Sweden are considering joining NATO, as you indicated. What are the benefits for Russia thus far?
If you're sitting in the Kremlin, and if you're looking at the situation in a blunt and honest way, this is turning out to be catastrophic for Russia. It is all the fears that they may have had materializing. They talked about being surrounded by NATO, which is not the reality, but now NATO is becoming much stronger. Vladimir Putin claimed that there was no Ukrainian nationality, that Ukraine was an artificial state. And as you pointed out, Ukrainian nationality has been reinforced. There's a new sense of national purpose. There's a kind of unity within Ukraine that many Russian-speaking Ukrainians feel extremely patriotic. So language doesn't define national loyalty. Ukraine as a state is getting closer and closer to the West. Now, it's too early to declare victory because many things can happen. Russia still has powerful military forces. Things can go badly. But if the trend continues, that if Ukraine can prevail, at least in terms of pushing the Russians back to the February 24th lines, this will be a terrible loss for Russia, because what would happen is that you would have, in the case of Kremlin, a situation where they are looking at an independent Ukraine that is building democracy, that is tied to the West, that is becoming economically successful, versus a Russia which will be under sanctions, where the economy is doing very, very poorly. And let's not forget that Russia is not a superpower in economic terms. The Russian GDP is only roughly in nominal terms that of Italy's, which means that it's about 1/8 or 1/10 that of the United States. And so it doesn't compare to that of NATO. They cannot afford a military competition. So there's a kind of irony here that they denied Ukrainian nationality, and now they are reinforcing Ukrainian nationality. An irony that they proclaimed that they worried about NATO enlargement, and now they may have NATO enlargement. They talked about NATO being aggressive, and it wasn't, but NATO now is much more unified and much more capable. So this miscalculation, if we in the West continue to support Ukraine, could lead to Russia realizing that they've been on the wrong path. That what had happened inside Russia is that you had this kind of corrupt regime that had missed historic opportunity after historic opportunity. I talk often in my addresses to various groups about something called the 30-year rule. Because if you look at what happened to the Axis powers after the end of the Second World War, when Germany, Japan, Italy were devastated by war, you project 30 years in front. 30 years later, these became very successful democracies with highly competitive advanced economies. Now look at Russia, and we are now basically 30 years after the collapse of the Soviet Union. And here you have Russia, which has vast natural resources, more than any other country, enormous scientific talent, and they are poor. On a per capita basis, Russia produces less than Turkey or Romania. And so in crucial ways, Russia has failed. And they have used ultranationalism, they had used subterfuges, they had used external adventures, instead of focusing on what they should be doing domestically, of cultivating their own garden, of building a successful state. So this kind of fantasy of a superpower restoration had prevented them from doing what Germany did or what Japan did, to become decent, highly successful, admired societies that contribute to the international system. That is an unforgivable loss.
We have heard so much about the use of tactical nuclear weapons. Is disarmament out of the window? What lessons are North Korea, Iran, and Pakistan learning from this situation developing in Ukraine?
It's a very important question that you're asking, because often we tend to forget that in 2004, there was something called the Budapest Memorandum. And Ukraine was persuaded to give up what at that time was the third largest nuclear arsenal in the world. They had inherited that from the Soviet Union. They did not have the codes, but they could have figured out the codes. But they gave that up in exchange for assurances by the United States, by Britain, and by Russia that their territorial sovereignty would be respected, that they would be safe within their borders. This invasion would not likely have happened if Ukraine was a nuclear power. And so the lesson to North Korea, to nuclear aspirant states like Iran, is if you can get nuclear weapons, you may buy yourself international immunity. And very importantly, you can buy yourself domestic impunity. In other words, if you have nuclear weapons, not only will you not be attacked from the outside, but there's less likelihood that they would interfere from the outside with your domestic repressive policies. And this is the example of North Korea, where the regime is engaged in horrific repression, but it cannot be touched because it's too risky. And so nuclear proliferation is one of the results of this invasion, as is the terrible attack on international law, and also a kind of frontal assault on the United Nations. Because let's not forget that the United Nations was supposed to provide collective security. They failed in this case. They failed to stop the war. When the Secretary General of the United Nations visited Russia, visited Vladimir Putin, he came away basically with nothing. And we have an example of this going back to 1935, when the League of Nations failed to stand up to the aggression by Mussolini. The League never recovered from that. So we also have a situation of enhanced nuclear proliferation, terrible damage to international law, and possibly a fatal blow to the United Nations.
I have another question. We talk about nuclear weapons, but there's another way that war is waged in this century. Those are cyber attacks, and Russia is able to do that. Cyber attacks are hard to set up and take time to deploy. Russia apparently has an advantage in that arena. What, in your opinion, is likely to happen as the Ukrainian-Russian conflict continues vis-a-vis cyber attacks on the West?
Russia has used cyber attacks in the past, and NATO has been aware of this. And Russia does have, as you suggest, tremendous capacity in terms of cyber attack. They have excellent scientists. They've invested enormous resources in this capability, but they are part of all sorts of other elements. And because Russia has engaged in cyber attacks before, in a way, there has been a long-term warning. So we look at a little place like Estonia, which has made astonishing progress in terms of cyber defense. They have almost like SWAT teams set up to counter cyber attacks. And throughout the West, more precautions have been taken, which doesn't mean that there's not continued vulnerability, but then Russia itself is vulnerable. So when you use cyber attacks on a large scale, especially once war breaks out, then you risk having those attacks leveled against you. And this may be one of the reasons why we haven't had larger cyber attacks by Russia. There have been some in Ukraine. There have been attempts. And so it's not that they have not done it, but the expectation that we had that it would be this kind of massive engagement where they would try to bring down infrastructure, that has not happened. And that's where perhaps there's been some deterrence, but it remains to be seen whether that would be sufficient deterrence or whether Russia would risk that cyber card, which I think in the long term would not be wise for them, because they just gave too much notice already. This election interference in the 2016 election, whatever the level was, whether it was significant or not, it raised alarm bells. And so in any kind of military operation, you need the element of surprise. There would not be that much of an element of surprise.
Another aspect, you're a professor of international relations. I would like to ask about the China and Russia dilemma. How is this relationship changing? From my view, China is comfortable emerging as a leader within the system already established, and they've been successful moving up as a big contender, as a superpower. But Russia chiefly wishes to disassemble the existing order because they don't think, they perhaps don't perceive themselves with economic power to participate in the system and be successful. So it will seem there are contrary approaches to the international system. How is that being resolved as those two countries appear to come together?
There was a meeting between Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin prior to the invasion of Ukraine. This was during the Olympics. Vladimir Putin was one of the few leaders who went to the Olympics. And the two declared that the friendship between Russia and China was without limits. What we are seeing right now is that there are limits. There are limits because it is a kind of artificial connection. As you rightly put it, China is in a different league. China is a huge economic power. Russia is not. China can back its foreign policy by real capacity. Russia has ambitions, but it lacks the capacity. And so, to the extent that there's a partnership, Russia is very much a junior partner, which they refuse to accept. They think that they're equal partners. And yet, what we see constantly is that China is the one that makes primary decisions in this, that Russia has become much more dependent on China because they're looking to sell energy to China that they cannot sell in the West. They need Chinese support at the United Nations. China has taken advantage of this. China has long-term historical grievances against Russia. They've been humiliated by Russia in the past. They have not forgotten that. And there was in 2019 a cover of The Economist magazine, which I think reflected the relationship very accurately, which was this giant panda sitting down and a small, tiny bear sitting on the knee of the giant panda. And that kind of indicated the power relationship of how minor Russia was in reality compared to China.
Thank you very much. And just in the last 30 seconds that we have, what is the most important thing that we should remember every time we're looking at this conflict between Russia, Ukraine, and NATO?
It's not a regional conflict. It foreshadows what is happening in the globe. This is a return of geopolitics. We have to understand that personalities matter and hard power matters. Yes, diplomacy and negotiations are crucial, but you have to have all of them integrated. And we in the West cannot afford to neglect hard power. That is the lesson, and there's an enormous amount at stake.
Well, thank you very much. Our audience always looks forward to your participation in the program, and thank you for challenging us with fresh thoughts, and we hope to have you back sometime soon.
Well, thank you for inviting me. My pleasure.